All right, this video is for Module 34 about the Phillips curve. So first of all, the Phillips curve is looking at the inflation rate and unemployment rate. This was basically looked at by a guy by the name of Alvin Phillips, and he studied statistics information from the 1960s, and what he found was that there seemed to be this indirect relationship between inflation and unemployment, meaning that as the unemployment rate went down, the inflation rate went up, and as the unemployment rate went up, inflation rate went down. So we had this indirect or inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. So when you graph it, it kind of looks a little funny just because of the fact that you'll see that our y-axis actually extends lower than our x-axis, and it does actually cross the x-axis, and so it's kind of interesting because the short-run Phillips curve, that's what it stands for, by the way, SRPC, the short-run Phillips curve actually goes below our 0% inflation rate. How is that possible? Can we have a negative inflation rate? Yes, you can. What's that called? That's called deflation, because when we have inflation, prices are going up, but when we have a negative inflation rate, prices are actually going down. We have deflation. So with the short-run Phillips curve, this is showing us this indirect relationship. It's downward sloping. As our unemployment rate goes down, our inflation rate goes up, and vice versa. So what he found, though, was that when he looked at the 1970s, because this was basically looking at the 1960s, and it was this beautiful, perfect downward sloping curve. And then all of a sudden the 1970s hit, and he was trying to plot the points on this curve, and what he found was that, wait a minute, we actually have a new curve. And the reason why was because, if you remember from all of our discussions in classes, is that what was going on economically speaking during the 1970s? We had stagflation. Remember that? We had all of those high prices of oil, and so as a result, it shifted our short-run aggregate supply curve. And so what Alvin Phillips decided, and he figured out, was that whenever we have supply shocks or changes in what we expect the inflation rate to be, it will shift our short-run Phillips curve. So a negative supply shock, will, and higher expected inflation will shift the curve up. So for example, here. And obviously a positive shock will lower expected inflation and will shift the curve down to here. So here's basically what happens is that if you think about it, what we have happening is that we are going to, let's say we're starting with our orange line, our original line here, is that this is when we have a 0% inflation. So this is our 0% inflation. And now what we have happening, when we have 0% inflation, we have an intersection right here of our short-run Phillips curve. So let's say that this is, I don't know, let's say it's 5% unemployment. Okay, so originally we have 5% unemployment at 0% inflation. But then let's say we have this supply shock that happens. And we have this supply shock that happens, and let's say, for example, our oil prices are going up. So now what we have happening is that our short-run Phillips curve shifts up. And so now at that 5%, now instead of inflation being 0%, now we're something at, like, let's say this is 2%. Okay, so because of our inflation, okay, increasing due to our supply shock, we are now at a higher inflation rate for every single unemployment rate. Okay, same thing here with this blue line. Okay, we have at 5%. Okay. Here, this, in order to have 5% unemployment rate, oops, sorry. in order to have the 5% unemployment rate, we would have to have a negative deflation. Sorry, my weird thing was going on there. But the point is that whenever we are looking at a shift in the short-run Phillips curve, we are looking at that because the supply shock happened. So something happened to, for example, commodity prices, or something happened to nominal wages, okay, or something happened to productivity. All of those things that cause the short-run Phillips curve or short-run supply curve to shift to the left or to the right. Okay, so that's in the short run. What about the long run? Well, with the long run, there is actually no trade-off. There's no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Here's why. Because if we try to maintain a unemployment rate that is less than if we're trying to maintain this low unemployment rate, what happens is that we are actually going to experience increasing levels of inflation. So I'm going to give you a for instance. So let's start here. And so we're going to start here, and here's our short-run Phillips curve. And I'm actually starting lower than what I had on the last slide. So we're going to start at point A. And so at point A, obviously, the inflation rate is 0%. And let's say that at point A, we have an unemployment rate of 5%. Now, here's what happens is that the government may decide that maybe, okay, 5%, too much, we don't like that inflation rate or unemployment rate, we want more people to have jobs. So we're going to go and use some fiscal policy or monetary policy to be able to drop it down. And we want to drop it down to, say, let's say 3%. Okay, well, if we want to bring our unemployment rate down to 3%, according to the short-run Phillips curve, what do we have to expect? Some inflation, right? So maybe, for example, on this curve, we're at point B. Point B lines up with 3% unemployment. Well, because we have 3% unemployment, we're going to have 2% inflation. All right. Well, here's the problem with that is that 2% is what the actual inflation rate is. But now going forward into the future, workers start to expect 2% inflation. So now we're expecting 2% inflation. It becomes built into what our expectations are. So now we're building in this expectation that we're going to have this 2% inflation rate. So now expected inflation moves shifts our Phillips curve. So this, remember, is different than here because this is expected inflation in the future. So now, in order to maintain that 3% unemployment rate of right here at point C, because that lines up, theoretically speaking, now we have to add 2% onto our actual inflation rate. So we're basically taking that 2% and we're doubling it, and now inflation is at 4%. And we keep continuing. So now 4% becomes the expected inflation rate. And so we have to add that to our actual inflation rate. And again, we're going to shift our short-run Phillips curve up. In order to maintain that 3%, now we're going to have to move it up. And now we're going to have an inflation rate. And actually, I'm sorry, that should be 8%. Okay, so we're going to have to add that 4% onto the already 4%. And so we're continuing on, and so we're continuing to move up. So here's the thing is that eventually what was figured out is that there is a sweet spot. If you think about it, and I gave this analogy in class of the Phillips curve is kind of like a seesaw, and you're going back and forth between unemployment rate and inflation rate. And somewhere in the middle, though, there's this nice balance, and there's this nice sweet spot. This is what we call the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, the NAIRU. Yes, I know it's a mouthful. It's also known as the natural rate of unemployment. We know that, right? This is the rate at which inflation doesn't change over time. Because what happens when you are at the natural rate of unemployment, let's say, for example, here, okay, the natural rate of unemployment is the long-run Phillips curve. Because if we stay at 5% unemployment rate, okay, our expected inflation balances out with our actual inflation. And so there's no reason to move. So there's no accelerating inflation over time. So the long-run Phillips curve is at the NAIRU because any unemployment rate less than this will lead to that accelerating rate of inflation, which I was showing here with A, B, C, and D. Okay, so keep in mind that the long-run Phillips curve is at the natural rate. Okay, and short-run Phillips curves are going to be downward sloping to illustrate in the short run those trade-offs that we have to give. But in the long run, it will all balance out, and it doesn't matter what the inflation rate is, that this is going to be our level of unemployment. Okay, so let's go back and let's add this to our graphing section in your binder. So remember, we have that graphing section because these are our key graphs. So here's what I want you to do is I want you to add this to your graphing section. So label it as Phillips curve. And for sure, I want you to graph this right graph here. This right graph is your Phillips curve. If you want to draw this left graph, okay, you can do that. But here's what I want you to do is I want you to answer these two questions. First of all, what causes movement along the short-run Phillips curve? So what I mean by that is that moving from point A to point B, what causes that? Going from A over here to B here. Or number two, what causes shifts in the Phillips curve? So what, for example, would cause movement from A to C? And this would look like, if I can draw it correctly here, here. That would be our short-run Phillips curve. So pause the video. Take a look at, by the way, this graph is not here for kicks and giggles. Our short run, our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model will be a good indicator for you, and the points correspond. So think about that, give it a second, pause, give it a shot, and then replay the video. All right, how'd you do? So if you're looking at from the causes of movements along this short-run Phillips curve. So we're moving from point A to point B. Well, if you're moving from A to B, look over here. We have A over here and B over here. What caused this? If you said a shift to the aggregate demand curve, you would be right. What causes our aggregate demand curve to move? That's right, shocks in demand. So shocks will shift the aggregate demand curve, either to the right or to the left. And again, it makes sense if you think about it. We already know, let's move over here and go back to our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. We already know that the long-run aggregate supply curve, this is the natural rate of output. This means this is our natural rate of unemployment, right? So if we all of a sudden have a demand shock that's a positive demand shock and we move it to the right, here's our new equilibrium, our short-run equilibrium. Well, here's what happened. This is, look what happened to my price level. So remember, here's our price level. From A to B, our price level went up, right? So price level went up. And going from A to B, okay, our output went up. And why did our output go up? Remember, anytime you're on this side of the long-run aggregate supply curve, our unemployment rate went down. We are actually below the natural rate of unemployment. So our unemployment rate went down. Oh gee, look over here on our Phillips curve now. At point A, okay, we're on the long-run Phillips curve. At point B, this is a higher inflation rate. That's what we said here. And a lower unemployment rate. That's what we saw here. Oh gee, that works out well. So give it a shot. Let's try something different here. What if I drew a curve here and I label this AD3, And let's say I want to label this point right here as Q. Where would that be on my Phillips curve? Give it a pause, try it. If you said your point Q is here or anywhere less than point A, you would be correct. So, moving along the Phillips curve is a result of demand shocks. All right, so then what causes shifts in the Phillips curve? Why did I move from point A to point C? Well, going from here to here, what happened? What caused that? Maybe this? What if I have a short run aggregate supply curve shift? If my short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, that will move it to point C. And so if I do this, and this is short run aggregate supply curve shift, and let's say I'm going to label this point right here X. Where would X be on your Phillips curve? If you said anywhere down here, you would be correct. Right? So, keep in mind that shifts in the Phillips curve are moved by supply shocks. Movement along the Phillips curve is due to demand shocks. All right, last point, last slide. I know this is a long video and I'm sorry. Deflation. All right, so deflation, remember, is going to be where prices actually drop. All right, so well, who are the winners and losers with deflation? Remember when we talked about inflation, we talked about winners and losers, and we played the royalty for a day little activity where everybody had to read off their little scenarios? Well, generally, who were the winners and losers in that case? Well, with inflation, generally, inflation causes borrowers to be winners and lenders to be losers because borrowers will pay back the loan with money that is going to be have a higher or a lower value than what they borrowed at. In the case of deflation, okay, borrowers are losing because they're going to have to pay back with money that is more valuable. Each dollar is going to be worth more because prices are going down, and lenders are actually losing, or winning, sorry. Lenders are actually winning. So because of that, since the borrowers are losing out, they're going to cut their spending and they're saying, whoa, 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 this is, you know, I can't do this because it's going to, I'm going to be paying back my money, I'm going to be paying back this loan with money that is a lot more valuable. So lenders, borrowers cut their spendings and lenders make out less loans. And so as a result, we're shifting the aggregate demand curve to the left, which creates more deflation. This is called debt deflation. Okay, so this is like a constant problem, in which, by the way, this is actually one of the problems that was continuing on with the Great Depression. Now, expected deflation will also affect interest rates because remember our Fisher effect? Remember when we talked about this lovely graph here? And we talked about how when we have inflation, for example, this is the interest rate, this is the loanable funds market, and when we have our interest rate originally was at 4%, okay, and then we have inflation, and so it moves both the supply and demand curves up. In this case, how much is inflation? If you said 10%, you would be correct because we're moving from 4% to 14%, so 10% inflation is included. All right, well, that's with inflation. Well, what about deflation? Deflation is when the prices go down. All right, so what if deflation, let's say deflation goes down to, let's say we have a deflation of 3%. So then, in this case, my equilibrium would go down here, and it'd be something like 1%, right? That makes sense? So 4 minus 3 will give us 1% would be our interest rate. Okay, that's fine. What happens if the deflation is more than what the nominal interest rate is? Meaning, like, what if the deflation is more than 4%? Let's say deflation goes down by 6%. Now we have a problem, because now what happens is that when we have deflation going to be more than the nominal interest rate, now you've hit what we call the zero bound. The zero bound is this idea that we can't have interest rates go down below 0%. We can't have a negative interest rate. That makes no sense. What does that mean? That a lender is going to go and give out a loan and also give out interest on that loan to the person that they are lending it to? Huh? That makes no sense. So the zero bound is basically the zero is the lowest interest rate that you can charge. So here's the thing though, is that because of expected deflation, that's the lowest you can go. Well, here's the problem is that sometimes we hit what we call a liquidity trap. This is when the monetary policy becomes ineffective because we've hit the zero bound. In other words, we have such low interest rates already, and we have a recession on top of that, and we need to fix it, but we can't go and lower interest rates any more than what they are. So what are you supposed to do? And that's when you've turned to fiscal policy. That is a problem that did occur in the 2008 recession, by the way. All right, that's it for now. I know it was a really long video. Thank you for being patient. Please let me know if you have any questions.